Hey guys, I'm Tim Langston with Red Dog Bushcraft, and ever since I started this series on cutting tools, I've had some pretty good responses with the different knives that we've been talking about. Just putting a little time in on this Frontier First that we won up at the gathering, trying to make a few little curls. Look how fine that thing does on this piece of sycamore. But that is not what we're going to be talking about today. I've been getting some questions about large knives, and do I use any large knives, and if so, what do I use, and what do I consider to be a large knife for bushcraft, survival, what's too big and what's not. And let me just say that in the eastern woodlands we don't use a lot of large knives. Most of the stuff that I use for bushcraft and teaching survival are pretty small blades. But depending on your area of operation, where you live in the world, what kind of resources you have, and even what you're doing, even here in the eastern woodlands, I do use some large knives. So that's going to really dictate the size of the knife and the type of knife that you would need. And there's many large knives out there that indigenous people use all over the world, and they use them because they work for them. And you're just going to have to research those areas, and just sometimes you have to buy different knives and try them. I'm getting ready to buy a cookery because I want to try one out. I've never owned one. I see a lot of videos on them, and I have some projects coming up that I think it would be advantageous to try that style of knife, but I've never had one before. What I do use, and I'll start off with the largest in my selection here. This is a large machete. It's one that it was made for the U.S. military, I believe. It's stamped U.S. and it has a number on it. And this is made by the Ontario Knife Company. It's a high carbon steel blade. It's a pretty decent thickness for most machetes, but for the area of operation that I'm in and for what I'm using this machete for, this one really works well for me. I did put it in a plastic sheath instead of the leather sheath that originally came with this knife, because in working with the river cane and the bamboo that I use is around the water, and the leather began to deteriorate, and even trying to use proper care and maintain that leather, it was pretty difficult to do. So before it completely deteriorated, I came across this plastic knife sheath, and it works out really well for me because I can go out, I can use it, and when I clean up the knife at the end of the day, I can wash out that knife sheath, wash it down with some fresh water, let it dry out, and store my knife back in it, and that seems to work for me. But as for a machete, and I've tried several, and we've used multiple knives when we're teaching classes, but this is really the only one that has really performed well for me for the type of work that we're doing with it. A little bit more of a heavy chopping is what we're using it for, which is really not what most machetes are made for. Most machetes are more for grass and small underbrush. But getting up into a little bit larger diameter and working with bamboo, I find that this thicker machete works very well for me. Every knife I've ever bought that's made by Ontario Knife Company has been an excellent steel and a good quality blade, and this machete is no exception. Now, another large knife that I use is a no-name knife. I say it's no name because several years ago I took a trip to the Smoky Mountain Knife Works in Tennessee, and I bought this blade, and this was the first knife that I ever assembled myself. I assembled it, put the final grind on it, and this is a good sized knife. It's what many of you would call a chopper. But if you see the bevel that's down here at the bottom of this blade, these long swooping curves, that really comes in handy when you're trying to work with some larger type material and trying to do some carving work, even with a knife of this size. Because of that long taper cutting surface, I find that it does very well. And for having a knife that before I was using a tomahawk, I was using it to process some wood that was bigger than what you'd want to do with your knife, smaller than it was really worth doing with an axe, and trying to find a lightweight in between, this knife processed wood very well. On the recommendation of a gentleman there, I went with stainless steel just because it was more forgiving when you're first learning how to work with your metals and your blades, and it worked out really well. They had a sheath here, a leather sheath that is a Winchester sheath that I simply bought, and then I modified it to fit this knife and made the keeper, or the latch, so that it would keep the knife in there a little bit better than what you see in most large knives like that. My latest project that I'm working on is this right here. Now this is an old hickory butcher knife, and it was the largest one that I could find, and you can tell I'd simply reprofiled the end of this. I took that hump out and I rounded it down a little bit. I changed this bevel just the slightest amount. I'm tapering it back even more than what they normally are to do away with that secondary bevel. I want that long sloping cutting edge to come all the way down from the top of this all the way down to a 0. And the purpose of this knife is we plan on making some shelters using grass. And the machete that I use is really too thick for cutting the grass. It's a pretty heavy blade, pretty thick blade. The heavy chopping knife doesn't work very well at all. You can use a saw, that works out real well, but in this tall broom straw and this sage style grass, a thin, long knife seems to work pretty well. Just the large butcher knife, as it was doing a good job. So I'm taking that, modifying it out a little bit. I'm going to make a nice sheath for it, and we're going to try that out for doing some grass collection for shelter building. But just to review for you real quick, to answer the question on large knives and is there a place for it in the eastern woodlands, in the survival and the bushcraft community, absolutely. It's all about the tool that works best for you in your environment and the projects that you're working on. So don't hesitate to buy some of those larger knives and go out and try them, see how you like them. I've got a few that I've found that work for me that I enjoy. I found a few of them that I didn't like, and I got rid of them, traded them, gave them away, or anyway, I don't possess them anymore. So that's what works for me. Go out, see what works for you. And thanks for joining me once again. I am Tim Langston with Red Dog Bushcraft, home of global safety and survival. Until next time, God bless, guys.